ως θεωρία. Okay. Λείπει. Απέκτησε περισσότερη φήμη λόγω της πρακτικής της παρά του θεωρητικού της προσανατολισμού. Έτσι, ο Jon Mills, θα δούμε σήμερα και θα τον ακούσουμε, ήδη από το 2005, με ένα paper για την κριτική της σχεσιακής ψυχανάλυσης, νομίζω ήταν ή στο Psychoanalytic Psychology ή στο Psychoanalytic Perspectives, δεν θυμάμαι τώρα, εξέτασε φιλοσοφικά με πάρα πολύ μεγάλη προσοχή το σχεσιακό ρεύμα. Γενικά ο ίδιος, πολυγραφότατος, δηλαδή έχει γράψει 30 βιβλία, είναι βραβευμένος, ανέπτυξε μία ψυχαναλυτική μεταφυσική που την ονόμασε διαλεκτική ψυχανάλυση, αυτό που λέμε process psychology, και βασίστηκε σε νέο-εγελιανές αρχές, οι οποίες τέλος πάντων τοποθέτησαν πάλι το ασυνείδητο στην καρδιά κάθε ψυχικής δραστηριότητας. Δηλαδή έρχεται σε μεγάλη αντίθεση με την σχεσιακή σκέψη σε διάφορα σημεία. Και η κλινική συμβολή του εντοπίζεται σε περιοχές της ψυχοπαθολογίας του attachment, του τραύματος, της ψύχωσης. Τι να πω, τα βιβλία είναι πάρα πολλά. Να αναφέρω έτσι και το Debating Relational Psychoanalysis, The Unconscious Abyss, το Treating Attachment Pathology, Innovation in Psychoanalysis, Conundrums, A Critique of Contemporary Psychoanalysis. Είναι πάρα πολλά. Αυτό που ενδιαφέρει είναι η μεγάλη κριτική στις έννοιες της ριζικής ισοτιμίας, της αποκέντρωσης του ασυνειδήτου και της πολλαπλότητας, των καταστάσεων εαυτού και της διυποκειμενικότητας. Και είναι μεγάλη χαρά σήμερα να τον ακούσουμε να ξεδιπλώνει τη σκέψη του.
Hello, welcome, Jon, to our chapter. It's great pleasure to have you with us. We had this very short introduction to your work, and we're waiting to hear you talk about your critique of intersubjectivity.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm quite grateful for the invitation. Yes, let me just give you a little overview. I was in graduate school in philosophy for a while and took a hiatus from the psychoanalytic world. And when I came back after my studies and I started reading the contemporary literature, I was immediately struck by a lack of philosophical sophistication. And so I decided to do a critique article on the relational school at the time, and this was back in the early 2000s, and that kind of made a splash, made some friends and enemies, and but it led me to want to delve into the literature and critique the whole movement even more, which culminated in my first book, which is Conundrums. And then more recently, about a decade after that, excuse me, I published Debating Relational Psychoanalysis, which spans about 15-year or so time period, where I had invited my critics against me to respond to my work. And I believe that's the first time in psychoanalytic history where you've seen people's works being critiqued as a back and forth exchange. So with that intro, yeah, I wanted to give a little overview of my conception of the relational school, which by definition its fulcrum is on the notion of intersubjectivity. And I'm going to get to more specifics throughout the talk. But as an overview, when Greenberg and Mitchell introduced the relational model back in 1983 with their book on object relations in psychoanalytic theory, they basically said that there was no integration possible between classical psychoanalytic thought and this turn toward the relational. So it was a fundamentally incompatible project, which I disagree with. But let's start with some of their tenets. One is the primacy of relatedness. So, meaning that what's more fundamental to anything is our relationship and relatedness to others. But, even though one can argue that is correct in many ways, they wanted to jettison the notion of drive theory. So, with that, they displaced the primacy of the unconscious in the stroke of a pen. This displacement or this radical rejection of drive, I believe, was motivated by the notion that, the drives are rather reductive. So we don't want to look in terms of a simplistic biological reduction to our evolutionary past. But nevertheless, this was an overstatement. What they wanted to do, I believe, the motivation is to emphasize and highlight the significance of the relational encounter with people. But again, they did so by an overstatement. So, for instance, by saying that that relations with others and not drives is the basic stuff of mental life, to use Mitchell's term, that it pits a binary. It's either this or that, when both are obviously operative. However, the notion of focusing or privileging the relationship is really nothing new. This goes back to object relations theories of various types, of self-psychology, of the interpersonal psychoanalytic movement. And it's all kind of been, kind of annexed into a new paradigm. Well, let's go with that. That there is a hybrid attempt to amalgamate these various earlier theories. So what we see is a new shift, and that is based on the notion of intersubjectivity. So the a major tenet of this relational model is an intersubjective ontology. So it again prioritizes the unit or our relation with others in general over intrapsychic life, the role of the unconscious and unconscious fantasy in your patients. So if this shift philosophically privileges intersubjectivity over subjectivity too. Intersubjectivity is more primary because the focus is on the unit or the dyad. Then what becomes of just the subject? And not only that, intersubjectivity is privileged over objectivity. So the notion that we could have some kind of more or less, untarnished view of facts in the empirical world that are not merely subjective interpretations, but that there are other modes and models of investigating the reality of the external world that comes into place. So issues around truth, universality, trying to locate some element of fact versus fiction is being decentered. So on one hand, the focus is on subjectivity, and there's an attunement, of course, to the patient's subjectivity, but the emphasis seems to be placed upon what's going on in the moment between two subjects. So this is a generic condition of any interpersonal interactions. We encounter the subjectivity of the other anytime we engage. Now, there can be a developmental view of intersubjectivity where things gradually, evolve and organically and naturally, or there can be a systems view, and this is largely what much of the literature tends to focus on, is the intersubjective system. So on one hand, there's an interdependent and intertwining subjectivities that give rise to this field or this world or this third, as they call it. And this is really what makes intersubjectivity the ground of all experience. Now we can question that, and I think it's good to question it, or we can also look at it in proportionality. To what degree is the intersubjective system, whatever that is, operative and mutually influential on each participant in the consulting room? Or we can reify the system, like some theorists do. So keep in mind, the minute you say intersubjectivity is the foundation of mental life, you have immediately moved away from the primacy of the unconscious. You've made the relationship primary. And we must question the degree of where does the intrapsychic lie? So for instance, the conflict model of the mind, the classical model, composed of this tempestuous world of antithetical drives that are pressing, pushing for expression. Libidinal economies are coming into clash with our innate aggressiveness, and it creates a defensive system in the psyche. So the defenses start to organize these internal conflicts, and they have gone through multitudinous compromise formations, and they come out in the transference projections in the treatment. I'm just trying to give you a synopsis of the intrapsychic. That seems to not be the focus here with the contemporary relationalists. Now, someone would want to quibble with this term, relational, intersubjectivity, and they want to separate themselves from one another, and they do. I mean, we all do. Stolorow doesn't want to be viewed as in the same, all in the same camp as every relational person. There's competitions. Benjamin wants to separate herself from her intersubjectivity theory. But regardless, they seem to coalesce around, similar themes. The third tenet of relationality relies on a psychoanalytic hermeneutics. So basically, the notion of context, contingency, and this notion of co-construction of experiences seems to be subject to ongoing interpretation. And with any type of hermeneutics, there tends to always be an interpretation of interpretations. So you have a circularity and a debate and an uncertainty that's always presupposed in hermeneutical discourse. But what has been called critical or dialectical constructivism, with, let's say, Hoffman introduces that, has been something that's been picked up. There's a mutual influence of co-constructing meaning, and there's a feeling that our epistemology is always fallible, it's never certain. There's a displacement of authority, of who is the one who knows, and all these are good things. But we also have to be careful that we don't fall into a trap that we know nothing, and that our training and our perception of the world and our analysis of things, while we should, of course, by facticity, we can't help but introduce our own subjectivity into anything we experience in the world. That's just taken for granted. However, that doesn't mean that it negates a certain objective or the notion of the real that presents itself. And I think there's a tension there that needs to be acknowledged and worked out, because it doesn't mean that you have to have one or the other. I mean, both are operative, the subject and the object, yet they are, on some level, one could say, in the intersubjective approach, that they form a unit, that they're inseparable in that sense because of the ongoing interactions and the ambience that is created in the intersubjective dyad. However, these quibbles can matter, because it doesn't mean that just because the focus is on subjectivity doesn't mean that it annuls the objective world. If that were the case, I mean, we'd all be in the loony bin. So, however, these are these are part of the emphasis that they want to place. That we co-create meaning together, we discover things together, we negotiate the meaning of things. It's not that I'm just imposing my interpretation on your psyche and you accept it and clap like a little seal. No, that's not what happens. But so far, we're not seeing a discourse on the unconscious. We're seeing a discourse on, the here and now present interactions that are going on between patient and analyst. Now, with this tenet of hermeneutics, there creeps into the literature all these references to postmodern thinking, and which I'll get into a little bit. But what that does is it places the significance more or less on language. And so you have many people who are putting the primacy of language first now, like Donald Stern in his book. The focus on language, the speech act, on discourse, on semiotics, on sign and signification, and social construction. Like we socially construct things, meanings all over. We reconstruct them, we rewrite them. So this is, sometimes it's important, and they make valid distinctions and arguments. Other times they're just thrown in there without thinking how this can challenge the most basic foundational principles of psychoanalysis. So where did the unconscious go? And if everything's based on language, everything's based upon intersubjectivity, then we really have a theory of consciousness, not a theory of unconsciousness. Now, you could save the day here by simply saying, well, yeah, they're both operative, but we're focusing more on this in the here and now. This matters more to patients. Like, for instance, not everybody's coming to see you for psychoanalysis. I mean, they're not committing to that thing. They're there to be helped, and you help them the best way you can. You might be much more focused on that as presenting problems than delving into one's childhood right away and dealing with all the dynamic conflicts and patterns and repetitions and things. That's not what the patient's there for. So you have to kind of work with what you got. But let's continue this. Let's suppose that we start to question more. Okay, if it's on the if the focus is on the the dyad, the unit, the patient-therapist relationship. Well, first of all, why would we presume that the patient wants to have a relationship with us to begin with? Some people are very disturbed and they're not even capable of having an authentic relationship. They have attachment pathologies. They're narcissistic, they're schizoid, their main conflicts and problems are in dealing with others, trusting them, feeling emotional connections. So that's a challenge in itself. But theoretically, if again, the focus is on the system, the intersubjective system unit, this begs the question of individuality. So, where did the individual go? Why are we focusing on the system rather than on the individual, the person in front of me? It also brings into question the separateness of the self from the analytic dyad. So some theorists have treaded into cold waters here by introducing there's no separation between the analyst and analysand, and in fact it generates a third subjectivity that is the glue that keeps everything together. Well, you mean to tell me that my sense of self is not separate from your sense of self? You start asking basic questions. How does this really play out practically in the therapy? So one critique here is that relational thinking that's again premised on the notion of the primacy of relatedness dissolves the centrality of the self. Like who's in the room here now, and who's treating who, and what's more of a priority here, you or us? It also has the danger of, even though wanting to emphasize the notion of subjectivity, it extracts and dislocates the subject from subjectivity. We're not focused so much on you, and subjectivity is now fluid. It's both of us. It's also generating this ambience, or this third agency, so to speak, which I'll critique in a second. So basically, this could lead down a rabbit hole that it decomposes personal identity by this emphasis. So one criticism is it can, even though it claims to be interested in the phenomenology of subjectivity, it can ignore the unique phenomenology and epistemological process of lived experience by collapsing everything into this relational ontology. Now, Seligman is a good example. I'll have a quote from him. He says, the analyst and patient are co-constructing a relationship where neither of them can be seen as distinct from the other, end quote. So we're constructing a relationship, co-constructing, where neither is distinct from the other. Well, I'm sorry, but that's a ridiculous ontological assertion. They're not really considering the impact of the statement when you say that everything is, intersubjectively mediated, because it's not. We have our own inner private worlds and experiences and fantasy that, now one could argue that we internalize others and others, interjections and such as that, but it still doesn't mean that there isn't a separate sense of self and internal experience. So Mitchell also, I'll give a quote from him. He says, "There is no experience that is not interpersonally mediated," end quote. So no experience that's not. So what happened to, the private language of my inner world here? What happens to, epistemological first-person experience that I have and access I have to my thoughts, feelings, desires, and conflicts? So when you do that, when you say there's nothing separated, there's, we're constituted then. That means we're caused by these, I guess, extrinsic forces that determine who we are as a unit. Now, Ogden, he also says, there, quote, there is no analyst, no analysand, aside from the process which generates the analytic third, as if there's a new agency that's created. Now, I'm going to return to that in a minute, but how can there be the reification of the system? As if there's a hypostasis, the system is now, an entity, or it's a macroanthropos, it's out there somewhere. So this is some, this is some of the criticism that philosophers would clearly pick up on. The other emphasis tends to be when you're not dislocating the subject from subjectivity, you focus on the notion of multiple selves. So Bromberg and Mitchell did write about this quite a bit. So how can you have multiple selves, like multiple personality disorder or something? Because when you say that, we're not, how is it possible, first of all? You're talking about different entities, different ontological configurations. Now, you could resolve that by talking about self states, that there are distributions of consciousness into certain pockets of lived experience that are, independent or quasi-independent, that are separate from other experiences that we keep in ourself. But to say there's no self, but there's multiple selves, this it's problematic on ontological grounds, because you introduce a plurality of contradictory essences. If you have a separate self or set selves, and they have their own unique configurations, then they have separate essences. They don't, there's incompatibility, because how can one essence relate to another when you don't share the same universality? You don't share the same structures, processes. So that actually was a major criticism that Aristotle had of Plato's ideal forms. That how can these forms relate with one another when they have contradictory or different essences? So with this also, and these are the bigger problems, it obfuscates the notion of agency. Who is making decisions, choices, responsibilities? Who owns the thoughts, feelings in the room when the system is privileged? Does the system now acquire its own, autonomy? Does it function like a godhead over which everything happens? So where is the personal agency when you focus on the reification of the system? So with that, it also undermines the notion of freedom. Who's in charge here? How is the system dictating the personal autonomy and lived experience that we would normally say we have free choice or capacity for choice and action over? So this is a critique that I have, is of being concerned that we are stripping the unique individual from its agency and its freedom. So at this point, let me just shift into a little bit more detail about three different intersubjective theorists: Robert Stolorow, Jessica Benjamin, and Thomas Ogden. First of all, let's start with Stolorow. Atwood, Orange, Brandshaft at one point was part of the group. They were writing in a contemporaneous time as Greenberg and Mitchell were, and what they wanted to focus on was the notion of phenomenology and lived experience. So this has a long tradition. It's nothing new, but Stolorow and Atwood, in one of their early books, had the hubris to say that they invented the term intersubjectivity, which is not true. And this comes from a long tradition of German idealism, and most notably Fichte, but the most famous is Hegel, which I'll return to. However, the term was introduced to the field, and so that's where the credit should be. It was introduced to the field, and so at face value, it looks like it's a new thing. What is this new kid on the block? So they started, writing a series of papers and books oriented more toward a phenomenological psychoanalytic approach. So focusing on the unique subjectivity of the patient and their lived experience in relation to the analyst. So the focus would here be on in terms of method as well. There's theory, there's clinical theory, and then there's technique. So reading much of their work, I think it's fair to say that they would say that the task or the goal of treatment would be the exploration and the development of the patient's subjectivity within an intersubjective system where experience is co-created or co-constructed. This seems to be across the board what the relational movement would agree with. Now, maybe not. And this is a problem, because the problem is there's no unified theory in relationality. They talk about a big R versus a little r theory. There's no unified theory. So it's whatever analyst says that they do, how they practice, how they think. But they kind of have a club, and they have identifications in the club with differentiations, but you can't even pin down people on what is your philosophy, because it varies from author to author. But with Stolorow early on, the focus on, when we use the term phenomenology, this goes back to German idealism as well, but it was introduced as a formal movement by Husserl, in early continental philosophy. So for Husserl, what's important is being able to experience and apprehend that which is disclosed, that which is given, that which appears. And the focus is on the here and now, the phenomenology perception of the experience of the patient, or both processes in the here and now. It is to bracket off certain ontological assumptions. It is to not be concerned with bigger metaphysical questions, but only to focus on what appears to consciousness. So this is what this is what Stolorow had more or less, annexed into his thought. Now, he was also a self-psychologist. So Kohut prefigures this whole movement of relationality and intersubjectivity. So it's not then a surprise to see in their books that the focus seems to be on some empathic yet introspective stance, being present in the moment, being tuned to affect, the notion of mirroring self-object needs of the patient, the narcissistic transference that develops, and it's based upon this notion of the validation and affirmation of the self, or self-experience. That's what's in many ways going on. So this once again places the centrality on the relationship, and more or less offers new experiences for the patient in terms of their relatedness with the analyst. Now, we can say, okay, but don't we all do that? Isn't that fundamental to all analysis? But what happened to the unconscious? If we're only focusing on interpersonal, the here and now, your experience, my understanding of your experience, and we're going to generate, co-construct meaning together. So it's about they would say the articulation of subjective experience. I guess that goes both ways. And of course, none of us know how the other person actually practices in their office. And we also know that people make up bullshit when they write things. There's no vignettes. Often people, just like Kohut made up, the story of Z, so which was himself. We don't know what really happens. Is there really a great deal of focus and work on the between the therapist and the analyst, and the patient, talking about the relationship? How do you feel about me? How do you feel about me? What do you perceive in me? What do you perceive in me? Is that really going on, like a frenzies mutual analysis? I don't know. Some people write in those ways. Or is it really more about the analyst being authentic and being themselves, being comfortable in their own personality, in their own shoes, in showing intense interest and empathic engagement with the patients, unpacking of their inner world as it comes out. And then when it comes out, it's brought into a dialogue between both parties, like co-participation. That seems reasonable to me. That's what we do. But isn't the focus, especially in classical theory, supposed to be on you? Isn't it supposed to mean you, the patient? I couldn't imagine keeping my patients if they came in and I'm just going to talk about me all the time. I mean, it's rather presumptuous and narcissistic, particularly personality disorders. They start screaming, get up and leave. So once again, it's up to us to try to understand exactly what do you mean by co-constructing something. We do that, right? I mean, so patient presents certain material. We try, the analyst is trying to understand its context to a greater organizing principles in the psyche of the patient, making connections to the past, looking at patterns of repetition, looking at sensitivities around people's defenses and their character structure, and making sense together in that way, like having a dialogue. Of course, we introduce our own thoughts, our own ideas, our own fantasies. We might not call it that in the moment to the patient, but we do use our inner experience to help. An unconscious communication, if you want to call it, or our own notion of projective identification that we experience it in the session. So on one hand, I think we can appreciate the notion that Stolorow and his colleagues, would want to focus on, co-constructing meaning, looking at, having a more coherent developmental narrative that is arrived at through this exploration. And what often appears in some of their writings is kind of wanting to look at the person holistically and taking more of a holistic approach, which also means to, on one hand, witness the traumas, the developmental traumas the patients bring, but on the other hand, to having a depathologizing focus. So I can appreciate that. but at the same time, I can appreciate it in the sense of depathologizing normative experience, even if it causes psychic pain. And that's part of our humanistic commitment as therapists. And we must remember that the term pathology derives from the Greek notion of pathos, right? Those who suffer. To be human beings, we all suffer, right? On some level. But all of this seems to boil down the approach to a theory of consciousness. I'm not seeing the focus here on wanting to delve into the depths, wanting to uncover and excavate the buried remains, so to speak, the repressed. But however, the notion of dissociation is very important to contemporary psychoanalytic theory. Often you'll hear, the notion of dissociation has really replaced the classical unconscious or the dynamic unconscious. Now, one thing that I can say about Stolorow is he makes a lot of scholarly blunders around Freud. It's like he hasn't really read Freud's texts. I've read his entire collected works, well, maybe not everything, but definitely most of it, and certainly all the most important papers. So, for instance, Stolorow wants to introduce this notion that Freud has the theory of an isolated mind, and that he has a one-person psychology. So it's what he calls the myth, as if there's some kind of solipsistic, monad of the mind. Leibniz introduced the notion of a monad as a self-enclosed unit that doesn't relate to anything else. Well, that's absolutely not true. He also refers to Freud as a Cartesian, like there's this, Cartesian container, as he puts it. It's like I can tell you there's nowhere in Freud's writings that he says the mind is solipsistic, the mind is self-enclosed, or it's isolated. In fact, he makes social psychology on par with individual psychology. You can't, everything's about relating to, parents, relating to the fantasy objects that we internalize from other human beings. So this is a straw man argument of his attempt to debunk metapsychology, yet he has not done so, because Freud always acknowledged it, if you want to call it a two-person psychology. He's always acknowledging the fact that we're unique subjective individuals that have our own internal dynamics that come into relation to other human beings that have the same, at least universal structures and processes. And that, of course, that is embedded in the social context that we call society, of course, within a certain cultural climate, with our own embodiments and our own linguistic processes based upon the geographic location and language we've been thrown into as part of our facticity. So the other thing is that he doesn't, Stolorow, Orange, who've written on this, they haven't even read Descartes. And like one of their books, I think it was Worlds of Experience, they reference Descartes a lot, but it's all the secondary literature. There's no reference to actually Descartes' meditations. So this notion that the mind is separate from the world, extended in space, is separate from our mental faculty, is not even something that Descartes wrote. But yet this is what's stated in all the textbooks. Descartes never said that there was a complete separateness ontologically between mind and body, or between mind and the external world. He said there is just a categorical distinction, but ontologically the two cannot be separated and they form a unit. So that notion is very important, forming a unit. It's much like what the intersubjectivists are saying, that we, the therapist and the patient, form a unit. However, that analogy doesn't quite work because, we are unique individual selves and subjects that can separate ourselves off from others, and we do all the time, just as we do in the consulting room. So let's try to do a recap here. What happened to the drives? They virtually disappeared in contemporary psychoanalysis. And even, I think Mark Solms recently tried to have his own retake on drive theory, where affect is dominant. But what about the nature of our embodiment? The nature of the fact that we're sentient beings, that we feel sensations, urges, desires, as well as affect, as well as emotion. Emotion is a little different than affect. Physical expression of feelings is different from internal affective resonance states. So I would not want to remotely deny our embodiment. I mean, it's entirely part of how we organize our lives. I mean, who's not aware that of their own body, their own aging, the fact that this can just be denied. This is why Freud wrote a lot about pain. He was in pain all the time from his cancer of the palate. And I think that that's important to keep in mind. That you don't have to have either or. It's just the fact is that we're complex human beings. There is the notion that if we get away from basic biological facts, then we're missing something there. The issue of temperaments are different for people. Issue of desire. So getting at least preserving room for the unconscious, the embodied unconscious, the intrapsychic life of the patient, I think is quite important, even if you prefer to practice more in the relational tradition, which I've always claimed that I have done. But I imagine much more with attunement to unconscious process than other relational analysts write about. So I want to shift now to Jessica Benjamin's recognition theory. it reminds me of a time I met her at a conference for the first time, and I went up to talk to her. No, I'm sorry, I don't want to embellish it. I was talking to someone else who's organized the conference. She comes up and just interrupts the conversation, asks for where the bathroom is, and then abruptly leaves. And I say, oh, this is somebody who knows how to recognize that, right? It's often funny that, you know, certain theories like, you know, self-psychology, they're all, you know, focused on the nature of the self, you know, empathic failures, breaches of empathy, and yet they can be quite narcissistic. I mean, everything's about them. The ego psychologists are funny too, because focusing on all this defense and control, but you get around some of them at a party and it's like they have no defenses. They're just, you know, all over. You know, a lot of the classical people are quite passive and as if they have no drive, you know. So it's kind of funny. The thing about Benjamin with the notion of mutual recognition that generates an analytic third is really that this is right out of Hegel. It's right out of the phenomenology of spirit, and particularly it's out of the most famous passage on the master-slave dialectic. And this is you know, important because on one hand, she's introduced, just like Stolorow's introduced the notion of intersubjectivity as a concept, she's introducing the notion of recognition, which has a long, long history in critical theory. The most, you know, the bigger proponent of that today would be Axel Honneth, who's a third generation critical theorist, returning to Hegel. And the notion is that it's intimately related to the notion of desire and lack. And we also know that Lacan had taken over Hegel's notion of desire and lack from attending Cogé's lectures on Hegel's phenomenology. So a lot of this goes back in many ways to early philosophical roots, but we don't know either that there's been a lack of acknowledgement, even bordering on plagiarism, or a lack of understanding of the historical roots of these ideas. But for Hegel, the notion of recognition is absolutely primary, but it's something that doesn't happen at first. Like you encounter two subjects encounter one another, and you both have needs that you don't realize the other has, but you have a relation where there could be a confrontation between two wills, between two psyches, between two subjects. What does the other have that I don't have? What does the other want from me? And here we become aware of our own desires for the desire of the other. And that could lead to, of course, a conflict. And that's why Hegel talked about this as a question of life or death. Back in the High Middle Ages, you know, it was an unsafe world. And not only that, there were stratifications of class. So hence there was the master and there was the servant. And the servitude is to the master. So hence there is a subordination of one subject to the other. But through mutual recognition, you come to realize, hey, that person has the same needs I have. They lack what I lack too. And I need to recognize him as a human being. And hence, this is the dawn of self-consciousness this is the introduction of an ethical relatedness to another person. So this has a long area of scholarship that I have published on, but I don't need to get into it now. But my first, not my first book, but my first scholarly, well, my first, put it this way, book that I am more proud of is The Unconscious Abyss, Hegel's Anticipation of Psychoanalysis. So I provide a detailed look at what he had to bring in terms of his theories. So for Benjamin, then, the recognition theory is really an organizing principle for her. Now we can see this, of course, in infant, mother observation research today. There's focus on the attunement to the baby and mutual gaze. But we also see it in Winnicott, putting, and even Anna Freud, putting emphasis on the unit, on the mother-child dyad, as well as attachment theory with Bowlby and Ainsworth. They were contemporaries as well, writing at the same time. So the notion is, though, the basic bones is recognizing the subjectivity of the other. And that, according to the theory, Hegel's theory, it would naturally lead into mutual recognition. And this is what Benjamin brings to the therapeutic context, is that by recognizing the unique subjectivity of the other, it leads to the mutuality growing into a relationship, because the subject or the analysand it's incumbent upon them to eventually recognize the subjectivity of the analyst. And through that, and it's, it might be done unconsciously at first, they come to internalize and recognize and appreciate what's being offered by the other person, as a person, not just as a role, not just as a piece of furniture sitting over there, or as just a pure function, but as a person. And this can be achieved through, mutual regulation and attunement. Once again, I'm not sure how people practice and how that's, plays out. But for her, she feels like that process then leads to an analytic third. And so, again, she falls into the same camp as Stolorow, in my opinion, because there's a co-creation of a system. Now, it's I would say she doesn't reify the system as much as, let's say, Ogden does. But one could claim it almost feels like when you're reading about the third, that it's like some kind of entity or being out there. My best or my let's say more generous reading would be that, without reifying the system, that this third is really a clinical space or a clearing that is generated between the two participants. And so the spacing that takes place, the processes that are activated in the consulting room to kind of open up a clearing for other ways of looking at things, or other perspectives that are overlaid or you know, enacted, so to speak. Now, the issue also becomes one of, or let's say a problem of oneness. How can this system contain everything and be called one? Like often they use the term unity, or a merger. It reminds me of some kind of sci-fi fantasy where, you know, the great singularity, we're all our consciousness is going to fuse into this one thing, and we've blended with the universe. So I'm not sure exactly, but if we look at this as a metaphor and not as a you know, a concretization, then we can play with the concept of the third, and we can appreciate it more because, yes, things do evolve. Yes, there might be an unconscious resonance that we're not quite aware of yet. Much like, let's say the Higgs boson field, you know, it's there, but it's hidden. And it presents itself a little bit to us at a time. So I prefer to look at the third in terms of the metaphor. Let me shift to Ogden, and let me get a quote from him. Okay. So let me read this quote. This was I think this was his 1995 paper in the International Journal of Psychoanalysis. He says the intersubjective third is understood as a third subject created by the unconscious interplay of analyst and analysand. At the same time, the analyst and analysand, qua analyst and analysand, are generated in the act of creating the analytic third. There is no analyst, no analysand, no analysis, aside from the process through which the analytic third is generated. Okay. Now he does talk about an unconscious interplay between the two parties, but he goes on to diminish it. So not only does he specifically hypostaticize the intersubjective system by making it an existent subjective entity, his words, hence another subject, like a person. He also asserts that each subject in the dyad is generated, quote, generated, presumably as a co-construction. Yet this is left unexplained. But he also nebulously introduces the notion of the analytic dyad is generated through the process of creating the analytic third, hence overshadowing his previous claim that the third is created by the intersubjective dyad. A convoluted thesis that invites misinterpretation. What I believe Ogden wants to convey is that the analytic dyad is transformed in the act of intersubjective engagement. But this assumption is subsequently overturned when he implies that the duality creates the third, yet is generated by the third. Hence begging the question of what exactly constitutes agency, causality, and the analytic third. This is evinced by his irrefutable erasure of personal identity altogether by claiming that there is no analyst or analysand, hence a negation, independent of the process. that brought the third subject into being to begin with, thereby collapsing the argument into a tautology or self-contradiction. So I'm more critical of that position because he takes leaps and bounds of introducing this notion that the third is like a ghost, that just materializes ex nihilo out of some void, and then creates each subject in the room. So it makes no sense. And but again, if we use a generous interpretation here is as metaphors, that there's transformations that are both spoken and unspoken that take place. Let's say the mystical magic that takes place when a good treatment is embarked upon. Okay, I'm mindful of our time, so I want to be able to wrap this up before we have a discussion. I think the one thing that I am most critical of is the naive adoption of postmodernism in contemporary scholarship. It's not that I am negating postmodern perspectives. It's just that they have a certain political agenda. For instance, by making everything about language, the language is primary. That would mean that by definition, the unconscious is invented afterwards, if it's invented at all, or develops at all, because if language is primary, even though we're thrown into it, that's a developmental achievement. We don't know how to speak, think when we're infants, but we're thrown into culture. This is Heidegger. Our thrownness in our embodiment, into our culture, into our gender, into our country of origin, into the language, and the greater cultural symbolic. These are all things that Lacan has taken over. Yes, that and speech and discourse is our way of communicating. It's a developmental achievement, though, and it doesn't mean that that there wouldn't be a primary unconscious of which consciousness evolves out of, and so that model's displaced. There's a denial of the value of metaphysics and epistemology when it comes with certain postmodern thinkers. So if you take the notion of Foucault, everything about Foucault is a social construction. Everything is about our positionality in the world based upon power differentials and the use of language and how we construct identities. We have consensuous ways of understanding the world. And it's not a surprise that this has been the new lingo that has been embraced by critical social justice ideology today, where everything is seen through the lens of identity, race, gender, and power differentials and colonialism. So I would think, though, that what the greater questions of, let's say, the notion of metaphysical realism get displaced with if everything's a social construction. So, for instance, you mean to tell me that you're socially constructing somebody's mind, meaning that you don't have some physical, biological processes going on, but you're co-constructing it in the moment. How about the fact that you know, the reality of the external world that exists independent of your mind, whether you conceive of it or not, is there. So, and it's being studied by natural science, physics being exemplar. And the notion of epistemology is also overturned, as if there's no such thing as objective facts. There's just what we define it to be or want it to be. Now, that's not to negate the value of first-person knowledge. It's just that we don't need to, again, have a bifurcation between subject and object that's so radical. And we don't need to radically claim that there's no such thing as facts and evidence that supports it as fact and truth. So the other thing about homocentrism is that, as I mentioned a little earlier, it opposes notions of selfhood because it focuses again on the role of language and social construction. It also brings into question the nature of agency. It wants to negate the notion of essentialism. And, you know, people often read these dirty words, you know, essence is bad, positivism is bad, objectivity is bad. Well, wait a minute. The notion of essence is absolutely vital to any theory because you're talking about something that is essential. Hence, as Aristotle would say, if it were to be removed, whatever we're talking about wouldn't exist. There has to be some essential elements and characteristics to the psyche. This is where the notion of universalism is very important. There's universals, meaning that human nature participates of these universals, regardless of gender, regardless of the unique subjectivity of the patient. For instance, getting back to classical theory, it's posited that all human beings have unconscious processes. All human beings have desire. All human beings have internal conflict on some level, with various degrees. That's why Freud said we're all ill, meaning neurotic. It's just a matter of degree. These defenses are operative. Denial is denial no matter what is being denied. That's universal. The notion of transference is universal. It's just the contents and the context has changed, and they are uniquely experienced and organized internally. Well, this stuff gets, you know, just thrown out the window to such a degree that some people would naively just dismiss the notion of objectivity altogether, as if we can't know something, we can't discover something like, you know, in medicine or physics or technology. That's just socially constructed by my mind, for instance. So those things, even though for those of us who have seriously studied people like, you know, Lacan or Foucault or Derrida, that are looking at linguistic structures and semiotics and how they work. If the agenda is to overturn metaphysics, objectivity, and science, it really is an assault on reason and truth and logos. And I would suggest that there's kernels of truth in all these ways of looking at things and gems to be mined, but we don't have to just, you know, buy into anyone's system, you know, totally. We can we can see, what is of value, how it applies to us, and how it helps us in the consulting room. So I'll leave on the notion of, before opening it up, the question of dissociation versus a dynamic unconscious. The term seems to be used all the time these days, just like now everything in psychology now seems to also focus around trauma, as if everything is a trauma. Somebody instead of like keeping traditional meaning of words, they can be repurposed to the point where they have more power and signification than they would have meant in the past. So instead of like a horrific thing happening to a person, now it could be that my feelings were hurt and I was traumatized. So I hope we can maintain there's distinctions between these things. So the use of dissociation is also kind of like that. It's become co-opted as a placeholder for the unconscious, or as a way of explaining how the psyche deals with whatever conflict one experiences, versus a dynamic unconscious that generates certain types of defenses that protect the self from collapse or destruction, or protects it from being aware of certain things it doesn't want to be aware of. So, however, once we have to define it, and people define dissociation differently in the literature, just like they define trauma differently. Let's focus on Don Stern. He talks about unformulated experience. This actually comes, in my reading, came from Lacan, talked about disformulated. The notion is that things are being blocked from consciousness, or they're being avoided, they're not being entertained. Hence, we can't articulate them through our language. So one could argue, is that a theory of consciousness that's working when dissociation is employed, or basically just happens to us? Or is there a unconscious agency, an unconscious ego, so to speak, that is directing the dissociative process as a way of defending or protecting the self from some unpleasant truth that it preferred not to confront or be aware of? So I don't think there's an incompatibility between dissociation and, let's say, the phenomenon of repression, where things are just starting to come in, be made more aware of into our consciousness, and then something happens where it's blocked, where it is occluded, where it is truncated, where it's prevented from materializing in consciousness. So I would say that you could argue that these things aren't an either or, but they're both and they're operative. So, but Stern will focus on that anything that's linguistically not articulated would fall into that camp, such as just again, it doesn't even form a thought. Something prevents it, and so hence you can't articulate that. Whereas, let's say Bromberg who really, his clinical theories have always focused on dissociation, where we even as a clinician have to stand in the spaces, to use his metaphor, bearing witness to other people's traumas. And not to mention the fact that when you're working with very severe pathology and people who have gone through horrific things, many times in my work, I've noticed my own self dissociating from remaining really attuned to the person's process because it's too horrific. And I have to protect myself. I find myself drifting out in some, fantasy land or daydreaming or whatever it might be, just to get myself away from that pain. So it's a very useful clinical tool and to be aware of for, working on our own countertransference, our own enactments that happen, and also how it would also reverberate with our own psyches and our own developmental experiences that might be difficult to have to modulate in the moment. But I think that it's fair to look at dissociation on different layers or different levels of stratification. So it could be something on which there are non-conscious events that are happening. Hence, that presupposes a certain unconscious ontology. We can, there has to be things that are stirring on in our embodied psyche, even though we're not fully aware of them, let alone able to articulate them. They remain in many ways unsymbolized. So when they do pop up, we want to try to see what they're trying to communicate, what they're trying to express. There, as Freud talked about, there's a sense to a symptom. There is a communication of what the symptom is trying to tell us about the internal conflict of the psyche, as let's say a compromise formation. So in that sense, a symptom makes sense. We wish to give it some symbolic and conscious meaning when it appears, whatever appears. There are momentary moments of fragmentation with dissociation, and in terms of self-continuity of the self. So this is why I think, to use Bromberg's term again, there's a space, there's a gap, there's a split in being, there's a lacuna, a hole in the self, a fracturing, a basic splitting. And in that sense, dissociation represents failures at representation. So we can't represent in the psyche what is unconsciously being harbored, and that's persisting in terms of unconscious memorializations. So if is one goal to make that which is memorialized unconsciously more consciously articulated, then dissociation would fall in that continuum. So at this point, I believe we are at about an hour and a half in, and I'll open this up for discussion.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Jon, because your presentation was very well articulated. You took us through your arguments step by step, and you spoke very slowly and clearly, and this helped us a lot to understand and follow you. Whoever wants to raise a question, they can do that. If you need help with translation, we'll try to help you. If you can speak in English, so much better. Froso.
Well, I want to say something because I have to leave. I'm obliged to leave. And although I don't know philosophy as you may do, and I agree with you about, for example, dissociation, I think that when the science put the question about what the electric current is, bodies or current, small bodies or current. So, and the answer was it is, it has to do with the observer. So the whole thing of meta-modern, I think it's how to view the whole world in terms of relationships, instead of object with qualities who relate to each other. So it's not, according to my thinking, it's not if it's wrong or right. It's another way of describing it and trying to understand it in terms of relationships. And many times you talk about things as ontology. You talk about the ontology of relationship, the ontology of the system, the reification. Yes, we may reify, but we have reified instincts, for example, all sorts of things, apart from meta-modern philosophy. But you seem to think of it as ontological, not as relationship. You may have all sorts of negative objections about it, but it's a thing on its own. It's a description of the world in terms of relationships. And if it is useful or not, if it helps us to relate to, for example, to the nature better, to understand nature better, which I think it does in terms of relationship. I don't know if psychoanalysis, if it does better to psychoanalysis, or it creates more problems than that it solves. But I think this is, it's not a matter of saying this is good and this is bad. Of course, if you see things differently, everything would be different. Freedom is not freedom, agency, or whatever you said is different. Subject is different. So I don't know what I say to you, but I think it's the starting point different somehow.
Well, let me respond by saying that there's different types of ontologies. So when we talk about, the study of being or presence, we aren't reifying that. So, and I am perfectly in agreement with you that these aren't static objects, but there's always a process of relations that take place between all forms of experience. In fact, in my book Origins on the Genesis of Psychic Reality, I painstakingly try to make an argument that everything is based upon a relational principle. But these relations also have to start from somewhere, and they developmentally unfold unconsciously, because we form relations, we form schemata and connections to our inner world. And the same would apply for when consciousness arises, that these are continuums, and these are like a rhizome that spreads out, and they form interconnected patterns and relationships. So I'm not at all negating what you just said. I would want to just qualify it a bit. And again, if the pragmatic application to a theory is that it offers an orienting principle for your work. And if it is in the, the focus is on relatedness, then that's useful. I should also say that, as a philosophical critic, and we're trained to argue. So that's why it might come across in a lot of my writings as quite pungent at times and austere. But at the same time, I'm not trying to tear or trash down valid arguments. I'm challenging things that I think are important to think about. And in the end, again, I identify myself as working as a relationalist.
Any other question? Κασιανή. Μικρόφωνο.
Can you hear me?
Ναι. Yes.
This would be my question. After all this critique, how do you define yourself? I mean, I found you much closer to the classical, traditional psychoanalytic meta theory than the relational theory. I understand you are not making a dichotomy, but I find you much closer to the European traditional classical psychoanalytic technique and theory, or not?
Well, I mean, I started out as a contemporary Freudian, and but I was trained in Chicago with Kohut being dominant, and then my supervising analyst was Merton Gill, and so he's from the interpersonal tradition, and that's when I went into philosophy, and then came back and started reading the literature, and then I became quite attracted to attachment theory. My first clinical book is called Treating Attachment Pathology. So in that phase of my life, I had more or less transmogrified myself, even though I might favor certain theoretical systems. The way I would practice would be much more relationally oriented than sitting back, saying nothing, letting patients speak, spewing out interpretations and things like that. That wouldn't be my clinical style. But I'm also very much interested in existential philosophy and introducing existential thinking to the clinical encounter. I'm a supervising analyst now on faculty at the New School for Existential Psychoanalysis. So it's I'm kind of all over the map, and so I don't really identify in any one camp. I prefer to think of myself as an independent thinker.
Yeah. Okay.
But how can you strike up a balance between a more traditional way of thinking and a more relational way of practicing? Because you have mentioned in your articles that you tend to work like a relational.
I think I have to tailor my approach to each individual client. And so some are going to require more engagement. Others, they need to be more autonomous. I let them take the lead on what is needed. So I don't practice the same way all the time. It's just based upon the case by case of what I think this person needs or requires. But I would never act like an impersonal, standoffish, staid, classical caricature of the analyst. I mean, you'll see me in blue jeans and my Crocs, you know, that's and a flannel shirt, you know, that's me. So I bring myself in the room, whether, you know, it's seen as professional or not.
Okay. Other questions? Naya.
Yeah. I would like to ask you, how do you think about the field theory, Barringers, and now the Ferro's field theory? What do you think about the field? Is it the same as the same critic? Do you think that it's the same trap as how you talked about analytic third, or the field can be studied as something which has other properties which we can study, we can... Πώς μπορούμε να το πούμε αυτό, βοηθήστε με λίγο.
It's a different kind of phenomenon. It's a different kind of phenomenon. Is this what you mean?
Όχι, ξέρετε τι εννοώ και τι θέλω να πω. Ότι εδώ πέρα και στη θεωρία, ας πούμε, του πεδίου, που είναι μια προέκταση, έτσι, και του βιονικού μοντέλου, ακόμα και στους Barringers, έχουμε κάποια στοιχεία. Έτσι. Πώς βλέπει αυτές τις θεωρίες? Έχουν την ίδια παγίδα όπως όταν μιλάμε για τον αναλυτικό τρίτο?
Ναι, αυτό το είπες αυτό. Έχεις να προσθέσουμε κάτι άλλο?
Όχι, αλλά ελπίζω να ήταν ξεκάθαρο.
Okay.
Did you understand my question or not? I repeated it in Greek.
Are you asking, is there a difference between the notion of the analytic third and the notion of field theory?
Yes and no. There are differences, but also the field is another place, not spatial space, but another space, like the transitional space of Winnicott, the field of the Barringers in their theory.
Well, yeah, I mean, these are the most important questions to try to articulate. What do we mean by that? So if we're saying that these are metaphors versus they're not really concrete entities by any means, and that's just poetics, it's still, what are the phenomenal properties that emerge in this collective engagement? And so it's almost like, reminds me of Theodore Reich, who's listening with the third ear. There's something else back there or out there. It's operative, but it's unconscious. It's trying to communicate itself. It's trying to materialize in some way. And yes, we have to use language that we have, even though it's not, you know, it's not precise, that we're getting at. It almost feels like there's something intuitive. Like, for instance, how do you define unconscious communication? Like, what is the process of it? It's mysterious. So I would be, when we're having the discussions like this, where we're trying to understand what is that third, or how's the expansion of the field operating here, those are important questions, and we all have a different take on it. Is it really a system? I guess if you say everything's interconnected, is everything interconnected? Well, that's a metaphysical question. And there's different forms of relatedness as well, even though we might stand in relation to objects that are impersonal, meaning they're not sentient. I might have a relationship to an object in my house through my fantasies. I become attached to it. So I'm in agreement that this isn't easy stuff to spell out, but I would think that it's really worthwhile to explore what we're really trying to get at.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You want to continue, Nadia?
Yes, and what do you think about using other notions or philosophies, for example, other theories of or for example, chaos theory or Deleuzian philosophy, in order to understand better all this process and the characteristics of a field of this space. What is your opinion? And another question, if I remember well his name, Larry Loudon. He's an epistemologist, I think sociologist, who doesn't understand the social sciences and as when they are evolving, he doesn't use Kuhn or Popper or anything. He tries to understand the evolving paradigm as phenomenon who can be clustered στο λέμε αυτό τώρα στα αγγλικά.
Τι θες να πεις?
I will rephrase. When we're talking about psychoanalytic innovation, we try to see the phenomena, the first class phenomena, the second class phenomena, according to him. And when we have an innovation, we must have another theory who explains the symptoms, who has the connection, and we have second-class phenomena which we can use the word new sensibilities, philosophical sensibilities, to understand the phenomenon, social sensibilities in order to understand something, or methodological sensibilities. For example, attachment theory or neuropsychoanalysis uses other utile
Other tools.
άλλα εργαλεία, ναι.
Other tools.
Other tools. Or the research on babies, etc. So if we use another type of understanding what is innovation in psychoanalysis, and not Kuhn's, is there a possibility that relational psychoanalysis is a kind of innovation or not? Excuse me for my English. I prefer to speak in French.
Well, it's okay. I'm sorry I can't speak your language, but I do think I understood here that on one hand, you know, any theory that has applicability, that is coherent, that is pragmatic, that's logical, that, you know, that has, you know, again, applied value, is to be, you know, acknowledged and celebrated even. So, I mean, whether it be chaos theory, you could see how that would apply to patients, you know, internal mental conflicts and how they spill over into relational patterns in their lives. Deleuze is an extremely difficult person to grasp, so I cannot claim that I've only read some of his work, but the notion of, you know, multiplicities, you know, spreading out makes a lot of sense. And the plurality of and the population of experience. I'm not familiar with the third person you're talking about, but when there's issues around, you know, first order, second order phenomenon, that's very useful. It reminds me of the whole field. Well, maybe it's not a field, but it's what we could call ordinal phenomenology, and that there are certain orders, complexities. You know, like for instance, this can of soda. You know, we've got the phenomenon of the can, but there's also other orders of phenomenon, like who went, you know, what the properties that are inside the drink, the beverage, the flavors, the carbonation. We see that they're a script on the can, and hence it's got certain language that has a greater meaning. It's been imposed. You've got the manufacturer of the can. You've got all these orders of phenomenal experiences that go into the production. So are there primary and secondary and tertiary orders to these things is a good question. What is the primary phenomenon? And I'm better at asking questions and answering them, but I appreciate the notion of different theories because they can be applied in certain contexts quite readily, whereas others may not. And the more one experiments with ideas and entertains different perspectives and points of view, I think it just expands, you know, our development in our way of perceiving the world in a more holistic way, more comprehensive ways. So now we might take odds at certain premises, and because they either don't fit into your worldview, or there are logical contradictions or incoherencies that don't make sense to you. So, you know, I think being, critiquing ideas is just a lifelong thing. And then we end up identifying with or gravitating toward certain systems of thought or methods of thinking, not just the content. And it's just whatever your preference is, and if you can justify it, then great.
Thank you. I wrote in the chat the name of this epistemologist.
Okay, I'll have to look that person up then. Latour or something?
Okay. Well, we only have 3 minutes left. Anybody interested in a quick question or comment? Katerina.
Yes, hi. I'd like to ask, because I'm not sure if I understood it right, about your approach regarding trauma and the tendency that exists to explain lots of behaviors through trauma these days. And I'm not sure if I understood if you're critical or not. Could you explain this again?
Yes, well, no, I'm not critical. It just depends upon the application. I think I was being a bit snide when people say everything is traumatic. That I don't agree with. But the emphasis, particularly on developmental traumas, has been something that I have written a great deal about. And, so for instance, there's so many different forms. They don't have to be, physical sexual abuse, for instance. I mean, they're just, all kinds of different things that we might experience growing up, or patients have been subjected to in terms of family of origin that have left traumatic residues on their psychic structure. So won't get into all that, and not just like PTSD and things, but that exist. Of course they do. I was just making a somewhat of a joke that there are some people that could claim everything is trauma based, and I don't believe that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I think it's about time. Oh, Eleni, we only have 2 or 3 minutes. Yes.
That's a very simple one. So what kind of, is there any chance we could have a metapsychology in relational psychoanalysis? And how can we keep the main values of psychoanalysis in the relational domain?
Well, that is a project that I'm not likely to embark on. But in my last book, book on this topic, debating relational psychoanalysis, I have a chapter on what I envision to be the future of relational psychoanalysis in terms of what I think it could do in terms of developing itself, especially in terms of theoretical foundations, clinical theory, and technique. It's a very ripe time and rich environment for innovations in the field, and particularly with the current turn toward the social, that could be mined for a lot of jewels. One could even develop a postmodern psychoanalysis based upon the principles, even though I would object to it. But I mean, there's a lot of potential creative innovations that the field could do if it wanted to. And so I wish them well, hope they do. I think Steve Kuchuk in particular has been advancing some important ideas. So, I don't profess to be able to keep up on all the literature these days. It's just so prolific. Well, I do want to thank everyone for coming and for your very kind invitation. And I'm quite grateful, Tanya. Thank you.
We thank you because you really helped us understand better some things, and we'll continue to read your article, which is very rich, the article you sent us on the critique of intersubjectivity. So we wish you well, and we hope we meet at some other time.
That would be delightful. Well, thank you.
Okay.
I appreciate it.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.